Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Kimberly, and I'm a project coordinator and psychologist from ARG Sangat. We could wait for 2 more minutes to see if more people join in, and then we will begin. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Kimberly Montero, and I am a psychologist and project coordinator based at Sangat's Addiction and Related Research Group, or the ARG. We received almost 500 registrants for this event, so we are excited to connect with everyone in attendance and those who will be viewing this via recording afterwards. Tonight's event is co-hosted by the ARG and the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy, CMHLP. To share a bit more about these organizations, the ARG, which is based in Goa, was founded in 2014 to create a world-class research group whose studies focus on addictions and mental health in low-resource settings. Building on Sangat's previous work, the ARG has forayed into addictions research from a public health perspective. We investigate addictions-related behaviors such as alcohol use, tobacco cessation, and substance use prevention across all age ranges. We also have gone beyond the scope to conduct studies on domestic violence, dating violence, depression, telepsychiatry, and more. The CMHLP was founded in 2007 and is based in Pune at the Indian Law Society. Its mission is to strengthen and transform the mental health of communities through holistically addressing individual and collective well-being. They focus on policy change, implementation research, and capacity building, and they are truly pioneers in these sectors. Their work is centered around various strategic themes, including law and policy reform, community-based mental health, and suicide prevention. We are very grateful to have panelists from both these organizations joining us in this evening. So I would request for them to introduce themselves. Arjun, if you don't mind, could you briefly introduce yourself to us and also the work that you do?
Hi, thanks, Kimberly, and hi, everybody. It's really great to see all of you over here. We've got a great turnout. So thank you for joining in this evening. My name is Arjun Kapoor. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy. I work across projects at the center. I co-lead different projects with my colleagues. I largely work in the space of youth suicide prevention. So I work with young people between the ages of 18 to 24. I also work on adolescent suicide prevention. And apart from that, I also sort of work on law and policy reform. So a lot of my work has been focused on the implementation of the Mental Health Care Act, the National Mental Health Policy of 2014, and more recently now, we've also started working on the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. So yeah, that's a brief background about the work that I do. By training, I'm a lawyer, so though I call myself a reluctant lawyer because I was never really good at the actual lawyering. So I always tell people that if you want to come for legal advice, don't come to me unless it's on the Mental Health Care Act. Yeah, so I completed my law degree in 2012. I then worked in the Supreme Court as a law clerk and a research assistant to a judge. And then I moved to working on access to justice in community settings in Gujarat. And I was working with a human rights organization there. And after that, I had an intuition and a calling, which came from somewhere inside. I don't know, it might have been processed over the years, but I had this desire to, I was talking about my journey after law school. I did a clerkship in the Supreme Court, and then I moved on to working on access to justice with marginalized communities in Gujarat. Can I just request everybody to be on mute? Even if you unmute yourselves accidentally, just make sure that you're muted so that doesn't interrupt us. All right, take 3. Yeah, so I was working in Gujarat, and I had over the years, I spent about 3 years working with marginalized communities on human rights and access to justice. And I think somewhere along the line, I had an intuition to move to psychology, to work with people and communities at a more therapeutic level. And that's how I transitioned to doing a master's in psychology, and then finished that, and then eventually joined the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy. So I'm going to stop here, Kimberly, and hand over back to you.
Thank you, Arjun, for sharing that. Of course, a vast amount of knowledge in your background, and we look forward to hearing from you on this panel discussion today. Patty, if you're comfortable, could you introduce yourself and your work to us?
Sure. Thanks, Kimberly, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Patty Gonzalez, and I lead the Youth Mental Health Research Group at Sangat, which is a not-for-profit mental health research organization in India. I'm based in Delhi myself. My educational background is in mental health. I have a BA and a PhD in psychology and an MSc in public health. In terms of my role, I work across different projects, particularly participatory youth research projects and digital innovations and interventions on depression, anxiety, and suicide prevention. And very broadly, my areas of work are across sort of program development, research, and a little bit of advocacy as well. Some of the programs that I lead are, there's one, and you can look these up, or I'll pop it in the link, the chat after, but is a program called It's Okay to Talk, which is a national public engagement campaign for young people's mental health. Another one is called Outlive, which coincidentally is also led with Arjun and the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy, which is a youth suicide prevention program, particularly looking at urban youth suicides. And a Bath Cheat, which is a recent program. It's a study that's focused on addressing depression and anxiety in school and university students through storytelling. I had a much more traditional entry into mental health. So I did the psychology route, but I think, just to say, it took me many years to find a job initially. And it took me, I think, 5 or 6 years to even find a job in a sort of psychology, mental health role. And this is about 12, 15 years ago. So I'm just, really grateful that you guys have organized this chat today, because I wish that people had these chats then. I didn't know how to identify the right kind of role or place for myself. So I really hope that everyone here is able to sort of glean something helpful from our discussion.
Thank you so much, Patty, for sharing that with us. And we look forward to hearing more about your perspective on this field of work later on in the panel discussion. Meera, if you don't mind, could you introduce us to yourself and to your area of work?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, Kimberly. Hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. So I'm Meera. I lead communications and media research at the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy. I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics honors from Miranda House, Delhi University, and a postgraduate diploma in communications from XIC, that's Xavier's Institute of Communications in Mumbai. As a lead of for comms and media research at the center, I kind of oversee all things comms at an organizational level, as well as for all our projects. So at the moment, we have around 12 projects at the center. So my work involves developing and designing effective strategies for both internal and external communication, as well as advocacy and outreach. I want to admit that my career trajectory has been a bit of a happenstance, so to speak, or absolute happenstance, because I mean, and that should be evident from my educational qualifications, and that's why a little chuckle. So not to say that I picked what came my way, but I actually picked what interested me, and that's why you'll see there's, there's maths and there's comms, and I must tell you, there's also a little bit of Hindustani classical music. Before I got into radio, I trained to be a classical singer, and that's why I actually came to Bombay and I was training under a guru. That story for another day. But when I look back now, I kind of see that there are dots to everything that I've done, and I kind of can join them and see a pattern there. How I actually got involved in mental health communications and research. Again, there's a fun story there, but I'll stick to, how this kind of played out for me. So I was a radio presenter for 12 years. From 2007 to 2019, I was presenting on radio as well as a radio producer. And towards the end of 2016, I started a radio show on everyday mental health that used to broadcast in metros in Delhi, Bombay, and Calcutta. And as a part of my initial research, I wanted to know what should this show really sound like. So for that, I got in touch with the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy for their guidance here in Pune. My understanding of mental health was very limited. It was very biomedical. It was, and it's only after I met Soumitra, Jasmine, Kaustubh, Arjun, all of them have actually been on my show, various shows for that matter. And after that, I learned how mental health is actually influenced by a number of factors: social, economic, cultural, structural, systemic, et cetera, And to actually make a positive change, there needs to be an intersectoral approach, and that requires an interdisciplinary approach. And I think media and communications is such an important discipline in that sense. So the center kind of provided me with that opportunity to build on what interested me. There was a lot of learning on the job, the vocabulary, the concepts, everything about mental health, stakeholder profiling. It was a very new set of stakeholders that I was working with. And also like kind of carving out this profile, because it isn't a career pathway that is spoken about in the same breath as a lot of other professions, I also want to take a few minutes to kind of explain what mental health communications as a field is. It's like an umbrella term for all things communications within the mental health sector. Like I said, it's a function that I've gradually built at the center. So while there are things that I'm doing, there's also a large chunk of what I still want to do. From an organizational point of view, mental health communications involves effective communication with all stakeholders, internal and external. Building a robust communication strategy, which is dynamic. It's a work in progress document. It's inclusive. It takes into account the larger objectives of the organization. So as an organization, who am I? What do I want to be perceived as? And we can talk about what this mumbo jumbo really translates into, when it comes to everyday work. So that's one part of mental health communications. And then there is this great potential to develop it into a discipline which actually involves looking at the impact of mental health communication, kind of re-looking at the traditional channels of communication with respect to different communities and groups, the language, tonality, cultural and linguistic considerations, media and mental health, kind of if you want to change the public discourse there, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities that are available? So that in a nutshell is mental health communications. I'm going to pause there, maybe come in later with more about what I do. Thanks.
Thank you, Meera, for sharing that. It's very interesting to hear about your diverse background and experiences. I would like to request Kedar to introduce himself to us and tell us more about his work.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thanks everyone for joining. It's really exciting to have the opportunity to be on this panel and to speak alongside people whose work I've heard about and admired for a long time. Not a very long time, but it's really nice to be here. And about me, I guess I've been at the Addictions and Related Research Group at Sangath for almost 2 years now. I've been working in the capacity of an interventionist, which basically means that I've been helping out in developing and delivering mental health treatments at the ARG. The two main ones that I've been involved with have been the Pehel intervention, which was a part of our domestic violence project, wherein we worked with survivors for their mental health and to improve the mental health outcomes. And currently I'm working on the Impress project, which is a pan-Goa trial of depression care. Before I was at the Addictions and Related Research Group, I was a counselor at a psychotherapy helpline. At that time, I would provide regular care and crisis care to clients anonymously over the phone. Like others have mentioned, my qualifications were sort of a bit here and there. I primarily studied clinical psychology, then I worked as a counselor, and now I sort of balance research and practice. So yeah, that's a little bit about me, and I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to talking more about our work in the rest of the discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Kedar. Great hearing from you, and can't wait to hear more about your experiences later on in this panel. Sammy, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself and your work to us.
Thank you. Thank you all for making time on your Thursday, whether you're here as a panelist or someone that's attending this, a potential future panelist a couple of years from now, perhaps. I am Sammy. I use she, her pronouns. I am a research fellow based at the ARG, funded by the Fulbright Nehru Fellowship. So it is an researcher exchange, essentially, between India and the US. I'm also a PhD student in counseling psychology at the University of Oregon. So most of my work there focuses on eating disorders, body image concerns, this thing called weight stigma, so anti-fat discrimination, essentially, and how we can reduce that, and the impact of weight-based discrimination on mental health. Prior to this, similar to other panelists, I had a bit of a unique academic trajectory. I have bachelor's degrees in Spanish literature and public health. So I did not study psychology, yet I'm pursuing my PhD in psychology, which I think complements each other really, really well, having that interdisciplinary training, in my very biased opinion. I also worked for 2 years prior to coming to the ARG in an epidemiology lab. So we were testing out all different counseling interventions, particularly promoting health behaviors among men who engage in sex work, men who have sex with other men and engage in stimulant use in the context of sex. So all different populations. And my current work in Goa is combination of my past work in substance use and my current work with eating habits, and it's looking at the relationship between adolescent alcohol use, eating habits, and body image concerns. How I got into research, I did not know this field existed. I knew I wanted to do work, particularly in women's health. So I was working with an NGO that supports survivors of gender-based violence, and I noticed the lack of care, mental health care specifically, and the large unmet need among the population. So my first research question was born of how can we get people care that will actually work in this context, given high levels of stigma and lack of providers. And I realized you can make a whole career out of that. So thank you all for joining. I'd love to hear where everybody, read where everyone is zooming in from. So if you're comfortable putting in the chat where you're calling from, it would be great to connect with a few of you there.
Thank you, Sammy, for that introduction. And yes, we would love to hear from all of you who have joined in more about where you've joined in from, and yes. Okay. All right, so we will move on with the agenda while we read where you're coming in from. I wanted to ask actually my first question to Meera, which is if you could share what a typical day looks like for you in considering the space that you work in, being so diverse and so different. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Yes, thanks for that, Kimberly. My day, of course. it involves a lot of unglamorous work, if I may term it as that. You're not planning and strategizing all the time. Besides, something that I've learned very early in life through my radio career was that execution of an idea is what separates potential from reality. You may think of the best idea ever, but if it's just on paper or in your head, and you can't execute it or implement it, it's just an idea. So yes, coming to what my day looks like, of course, there's a lot of execution. There's a lot of reviewing. There is some amount of writing as well. Ideas that we've brainstormed. We've kind of put together this document, this spreadsheet with our strategic ideas. So kind of, executing those. I work very closely with my colleague, Sufan Hassan. He's our visual designer. And design involves a lot of aesthetics, but it's also used as a tool to make communication more accessible using design concepts. So kind of brainstorming on how it's not just aesthetics, but using it strategically there. Then any space where the center is kind of represented, to make sure that the story and the tone is consistent there. So whether that involves making presentations or presenting those presentations to newer partners, I kind of lead exploratory conversations. I also like to have my eye on the center's main contact email ID. I want to see the kind of requests that are coming in. So I do spend a lot of time, or actually like maybe half an hour of the day, looking at those and responding to some of them. Another very important thing that I do through the day is working with projects to assist them in their communication outputs, which is based on their comm strategies. So whether it's, for social media or it's a web page, it could be anything, a recruitment form, a manual, a brochure, anything that they're creating. Just kind of review the content. The endeavor is to build the communication capabilities of my colleagues so that you're not kind of doing this all the time. You're not starting from scratch. So we've developed a lot of checklists, guidelines, templates that they can use. I like to do fortnightly or maybe monthly calls, check-in calls with different projects, just to understand where they are with their comms needs. Also, like I had initially said, this is a vertical that, we've kind of built from scratch at the center. So creating and streamlining a lot of processes to make sure that there's optimal usage of time and resources. I spent some time also looking at internal comms. I think that's something which is very underrated. It's such an important tool for organizations to kind of embed their values, core values in one's day-to-day work and interactions. And especially when you have an organization like the center, which is, the projects are so diverse and you have people based out of different geographical locations. So kind of putting in place a communication system or process where there's enough cross-pollination between teams. We want to be characterized as a learning organization. And for that, you need to put in systems. So, just working out what these processes could look like. Yes, there is a part of social media management as well, staying up to date on the trends that are involved. Because of my past experience, I like to look at, audio visual outputs. So starting from scratch, whether it's scripting them, storyboarding them, execution, editing them, and then putting them out. Like I said, of course, there's also creating these comm strategies for, dissemination of larger announcements, launches. Did I say calls? And more calls? So yeah, that's pretty much what a day really looks like.
Thank you, Meera, for that. It's very interesting to hear about, and definitely how important comms is in a place such as mental health research. I would actually like to ask Arjun next what a typical workday looks like, or what tasks happen in a typical workday for him.
Thank
Yes. Okay, so maybe Arjun, are you there? Okay, it seems like he's frozen and we've lost him for a while. Actually, if I could put this, sorry. Hi, hi, Arjun, we lost you a bit in the middle. Lost them again. All right. So Patty, yes, we would put the same question forward to you, which is, could you share with the people interested in working in mental health what some of the tasks that you do are?
Sure. So, I mean, it's hard to say it's a typical day, so maybe I'll talk about it like as a typical week. But it's a lot of the things Mira mentioned, but they vary in terms of priority. So, for example, a typical day would often start quite early with emails, meetings, working or supervising a team, where it's typically around sort of understanding progress, troubleshooting problems, and again, similar to what Mira said, some of these are fortnightly, some are monthly. Because I work on sort of multiple other teams, I have a lot of color coded Excels that then I write down on color coded post-its, and then you get the picture. But lots of planning has to go into sort of juggling these different schedules. I spend a lot of time, even though I have a research role, I spend a lot of time doing admin, finance, governance, again, very unglamorous tasks, and they take up much more time than sometimes I think people imagine. But, I really enjoy them as well. And, they're a really integral part of how well a research team or how well a research study functions. So I think finding your joy in some of that admin kind of stuff is really important if you do want to work in this field. Another part of a week sometimes might also consist of field work. So, going and seeing the study or research work in action. It might also entail attending a workshop or a conference. Another big part of my job is also writing applications, grant applications in particular. And related to this, again, talking with collaborators or finding new collaborators. And periodically, another important task is around planning for the future. So, for example, setting milestones, having an annual plan, or we use these kinds of charts called Gantt charts or planning tools. Doing that quite regularly is a big part of my job as well. And again, not surprisingly though, but one of the things that you think you will do the most of, which you do the least of, is actually reading or writing anything related to research. But there is again a part of my role is in writing research protocols, analyzing data, making presentations, even doing social media sometimes, writing articles. Again, but the proportion of time unfortunately tends to be less sometimes. But again, as I said, it varies. And a last part of my role is also mentoring some number of younger people. Yeah, but as I said, priorities keep changing. So planning is really important. And I use a kind of quality over quantity approach. So, you can only do so much in so much time. So I'm really trying to do those tasks in a focused way so that, you may not get everything done, but things that you do get done, you get them done as well as you can. That's kind of what a typical week looks like for me.
All right, Patty, thank you so much for sharing. Actually, Arjun has rejoined the meeting, so we're trying to. Can you hear it, Arjun?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I think my video is not on and I can't turn it on for some reason.
Okay.
I can just continue if that helps.
Yeah. We're
Okay.
working on it, definitely for sure.
Sure. No,
yeah,
this
by
is
the time
easier.
we're
It's easier to speak without being seen. Right. So actually, my typical day looks a lot like what Mira and sort of Patty have already shared. So I don't want to repeat what they've already shared, but I think just to say that the work, in a sense, kind of, if I had to sort of divide it into different buckets, I would sort of identify 3 or 4. So the first is a lot of our work is implementation research, right? So we design, develop, implement mental health and suicide prevention interventions. And then, of course, we evaluate their impact. So there's actually a lot of day-to-day implementation work, which goes on behind the scenes, and to what Mira alluded as the not so glamorous work. It's actually a lot of ground work of getting systems going, putting in processes in place, ensuring that activities are happening the way they need to in a very typical project management sort of template. So a lot of the work actually sort of goes, a lot of the daily work goes into sort of monitoring, supervising whether things are actually happening, because we work with teams. So there are multiple people working on a particular project, and they all have different roles depending on the requirements of that project or the kind of intervention that we're actually developing. So a lot of the time actually goes in just coordinating, monitoring, ensuring that implementation is happening, and actually implementing the activities that need to be happening. The second part of it, I would say, is, of course, management. And some of us at the center also do play a managerial role, also for the larger center as well. And this includes sort of ensuring organizational development, ensuring organizational culture. We're also, at least CMHLP is a relatively new organization. We are in transition. We're growing from a small to a mid-level organization. And when that transition happens, you realize that a lot of internal work also needs to go into building the organization along with your colleagues and putting systems in place. So some part of our work also goes into sort of organizational development and putting those systems and processes in place. The third bucket that I would sort of talk about would be some of the conceptualization, strategic, design-oriented stuff, which is really the fun stuff. But unfortunately, we don't get to spend as much time as we would like to on those aspects because of the multiple things that we're doing. But yeah, some of us do spend time conceptualizing interventions that we potentially want to develop. We do, of course, spend time with the team. The team collectively does think a lot about how even implementation needs to be conceptualized. What kind of strategies do we want to go about? How do we actually go about implementing? So, for example, since Meera is here, Meera and I work very closely, and our teams work very closely on communications. So how do we communicate about a certain aspect of the project? What needs to be the key messaging? Who's the target audience? What kind of a creative or visual design language do we want to create for that? How does that serve the purpose of the project itself? So that's one example of how conceptualization also happens from time to time on a daily basis, or maybe if not on a daily basis, but quite frequently, depending on the requirements of the project itself. And along with the conceptualization, then also comes the tough part, which is grant writing, because a lot of our work is in that sense grant funded. So we put in grant proposals, we think of an intervention in terms of what we want to do, we design the proposal, and then we put in a grant, and often grant applications they're quite elaborate, they have a lot of requirements. And that's something that we have to do continuously, because that's the only way our organization sustain the work that we do, because we don't have fixed sources of income as such. They're all grant funded. And the last bit that I would say, or the second last bit, would be, of course, stakeholder engagement. So sometimes our work involves doing workshops, say, with different stakeholders or with government officials. Or it might involve running capacity building initiatives or co-design workshops. So a fair bit of time also goes into developing and implementing those activities. Can you hear me? Because everybody's frozen on the screen again.
Oh, no, we can.
Yeah. Okay, great. And the last bit, which I really wished I had all the time to do in the world, but I don't, is my own reading. Reading current affairs to understand what's happening in the world, to keep oneself updated about academic developments within the mental health space, to read scientific literature, because a lot of our work is evidence-based or draws on existing research to see how we can further that. And also, reading in general, reading a novel, reading a poem, reading nonfiction, reading fiction. I think all of that goes a long way in opening up our minds for the kind of work that we do, and that really makes it all the more exciting. But yeah, I wish I had more time or more dedicated time to doing that.
Thank you so much, Arjun, for sharing that. And we want to actually move forward, I think, because we have, as you know, a lot on our agenda today. So we're actually going to start with some of the questions that have come in. And yeah, my first question is actually to Kedar. If you could tell us, so sometimes there are misconceptions that psychologists need to choose either clinical work or research, but you are an example of someone who has done both and continues to do both. And so could you share more about how you leverage your background as a counselor to inform your work as a researcher?
Thanks, Kim, for that question. I think it's a very good one because I think like Meera mentioned and like Sammy mentioned, even I sort of, looking back, it might seem like this path was intentional, but I assure you that it was definitely not the case, to be balancing these or to find myself in this position. You can connect the dots, as she said, but that is a retrospective exercise. And at the time, I would have never guessed, that I'd be balancing these two kind of, different perspectives or different academic, areas. But I guess over the past 2 years at the ARG, what I've realized is that there is a lot of value that someone with clinical training can bring to the research space. And I think the reason that I've been able to realize this is because I've been made to feel valuable as a clinician. And unfortunately, I think with the time that we have, I won't be able to go into as much detail as I'd like, but I'm happy to take any questions about this or interact individually with anyone who would like to know more. I guess for me, it's been more about, how every process can be informed. Like Arjun said, there are so many different kinds of things that we do every day, whether it's even applying for a grant or whether it's, talking about implementation processes. When you have some amount of clinical exposure, you have the opportunity to think of it from a client-centric perspective. And more importantly, I think also you have the information about how the nuts and bolts of the intervention really works, that can help you make implementation related decisions, which I think I personally would have found much harder if I did not have that information, or if I did not feel like I was able to put people first, so to speak, which is, I think, something which we all do in our own capacities, whether in communication or in pure research, so to speak, if there is such a thing. But we are always putting people first. But I think as a clinician, you have the opportunity to treat people differently throughout the process. Like I said, even for example, as I've grown in the organization, I have opportunities to be a supervisor. And I think there also, even as a leader or as a people manager, clinical skills bring a lot to the table in terms of listening, being there for someone, being non-judgmental towards them. Anyone, would appreciate a supervisor like that. So I think that, looking back, even though probably my qualifications would not necessarily meet the specifications of the role that I'm in today or the larger organization that I'm in today, I do sort of value, that training. And that's why I'm very glad that you asked me this question. So I got the opportunity to talk a little bit about it. But like I said, I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take more questions or go into detail about this. I can see that someone has already asked a question. So in case if time permits, I'd be happy to answer.
Yes, and thank you, Kedar, for addressing that as well. We see your enthusiastic questions in the chat box. We will respond to them if we can, but if we cannot, we're sending a survey, a sort of form after this, and sharing resources with you so that hopefully they will answer your question to some extent. I actually want to ask my next question to Sammy, which is, Sammy, you have received your bachelor's in public health and you are pursuing your PhD in counseling psychology. So I wanted to ask, what is the overlap between the skill set or knowledge base in public health versus psychology?
That is a great question, and one that we saw as a common thread among a lot of the ones people submitted in the Zoom. I think if we're talking from a historical standpoint, people would say public health is targeting population level health, whereas psychology is often targeting individual level what we're seeing in the present is the fields are realizing there's a lot more common ground and shared goals. So there's a lot of expansion now into community psychology as well, and addressing needs at the community level. Having psychology studies inform policy, CMHLP is a great example of that. As far as the actual skills, and this can be relevant if there are people here whose backgrounds are in social work, nursing, whatever else it might be, research skills are research skills. So if you can run statistical analyses on a data set in economics, you have those same skills to transfer over into psych data. It's important you then grow your knowledge on the actual topic you're studying, but your actual statistical skills will still exist. If you have qualitative research skills, those transfer over as well. If you have grant writing skills, ethical review board experience, Kedar is a great example. You can even gain clinical experience and make it relevant to research. So hopefully this also can touch on folks that are applying for those entry-level jobs. Even if you're not coming from an extensive research background and you've done some great community engagement work, community engagement is a really important skill to bring to psychology research as well. So I think it's about how you spin it. But as for the differences or similarities in the skill sets between public health and psychology, I think there are a lot of similarities, and the differences actually complement each other really, really well and make you a stronger researcher in whatever discipline you're shifting towards.
Great. Thank you, Sammy, so much for that response. I would actually like to ask Patty a question, because we've, looking at these questions that are coming into the chat, we actually received many questions from people with backgrounds in nursing, social work, anthropology, and medicine, among other disciplines. So we would like to hear how interdisciplinary collaboration plays a role in mental health research. And we would love to hear about any insight you have gained from working with professionals from different backgrounds.
Great, thanks for that question. So maybe I'll answer in two parts. One is kind of a general response, and the second is an example of how we did this recently, and we sort of continue to do this in projects we work on. The first is to say, unlike before, where the health fields were really insular, and if you worked in like cardiac medicine, like that was it, or if you were a counselor, that was it, or you were in mental health, that was it. That approach is definitely changing, and mental health is becoming more interdisciplinary. Whether this is, for example, research or implementation teams now require bringing together people from different disciplines. It requires you to collaborate with, what I would call sort of non-traditional partners. So for example, working with corporates, working with industry, working with the government, etc. So different fields coming together, including outside of academia, to include, for instance, a big part of, I think, what all of us on this panel work on is including service users, or we call a term we use is people who have lived experience. So these are, community members, individuals who have experienced different mental health problems, mental health needs, illnesses, etc. And also working with different kinds of non-profit organizations, again, of which I think most of us belong. Sangat, for example, where I work, we operate very much in this way. So interdisciplinary teams would include, let's say, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, researchers, young people, service users, social workers, psychoeducators, administrative support professionals, etc., so on. This is one example, I think, of, you don't have to be a counselor to work in a mental health organization. And I think Sammy highlighted this well. You could have a very specific, say, skill set in, one kind of research method. Maybe you've never worked in mental health, but you can apply that into a mental health related topic. One of the projects, and in fact, it's okay to talk, and there's another program, sort of a website that we launched a few years ago called manmela.in. I'll pop that in chat after. But you'll get a sense of, how there was a team of researchers, psychiatrists, psychologists, artists, young people, video makers, technologists, who all, and also I think exhibition creators who all came together to work on a youth mental health project. So these were, not people who had mental health training or, any sort of background in that sense, but they came together to work on a digital storytelling project for mental health. Oh, and the last example to share, and this is maybe relevant to anyone who's on the call. A big part of what I think most of us on this webinar advocate for and we work in is something called task sharing. And what this simply means is that, people who don't have mental health backgrounds can effectively serve in mental health roles. So for example, if you just want to learn how to provide basic support to your colleagues, your family members, friends, etc., that's something that you absolutely can learn to do and be trained to do fairly quickly as well. And you do not need to have any kind of mental health training. So this is also moving beyond, looking at other kinds of fields that you might work in, whether it's nursing, social work, other kinds of medicine, etc. So there's a lot of movement possible. I think, if you are interested, I think there's many people who would be happy to collaborate, and it's something that is very, very much encouraged.
Great. Thank you so much, Patty. Like you said, I think, and like as I'm seeing a lot of resources that hopefully we could share, and especially the ones that you mentioned, that would help give our audience better insight into what exactly it is that we're talking about and draw a clearer picture for them. Yes. My next question is to Meera. So Meera, prior to this role, you worked as a radio presenter and producer and senior brand services manager. So what advice would you give to someone who's looking to shift in careers? And that's my first part of the question. And the second part is, how do you leverage the skills developed from your previous roles in your current role as the communication and media research lead at CMHLP?
Thanks for that question, Kimberly. Shifting careers. Yeah, I'm just pretty perfect to answer that question because every 10, 12 years, I have actually changed the sector. I don't know what it is about it, but or me, that I've done that. So looking at your first part of the question, shifting careers, transitioning into something that you really want to do, I think that's the first question, right? Start with self-reflection. What is it about this career choice that really interests you? Does it align with your passion? I don't think we talk enough about, when you're making movements from one sector to another, and in that transition, how there could be a change in one's designation, salary cuts. And I think it's important to view this in terms of the work that you're going to do. What does that really hold for you? It's important to have that discussion with oneself. I also want to say that there will be a lot of learning on the job. You'll really have to be a fly on the wall, soak it all in, assimilate it before you can actually tangibly contribute. But at the same time, I also want to say that a lot of people, say that when you're shifting careers or when you're taking up something new, you've got to be flexible because you'll have to learn a lot. I think it's very important to define what flexibility really means for you. You don't want to be bending backwards all the time. So be flexible, but define what flexibility is. While you are starting as a fresher in that sector, you're not an absolute novice. It's important to identify what are those transferable skills. And I'd also like to say, what are those values that you'd really want to take from one career to the other? And I will, elaborate on this a little later in the second part of the question. But list your transferable skills. That's a very important confidence building exercise. It tremendously helped me. And something that I have not had the luxury of till now, and I'm envious of anybody else who does, is identify a mentor who has your best interests at heart, because the advice and the direction that you're going to get from there will really be helpful. So yeah, that would be what one needs to keep in mind when making a career shift. How do I leverage the skills from my previous jobs? Yes, I've done a lot of varied work, but if I were to look at, yes, being a senior brand services manager, so I worked at an ad agency called Lintas. And, while a lot of us might think that, creative folks actually just one fine day think up an idea and you have an ad out there, as far as Lintas goes, back then at least, research was at the heart of any creative communication. Before making any piece of communication, they would test scripts, with the intended audience, then come back, storyboard it with the feedback, go test the storyboard, then render it into something known as an animatics, test that. So there was rigorous testing what the ending of the ad should look like. And it was a good introduction to the world of how gut instinct only can help you hypothesize. Beyond that, the true litmus test is, when you actually put this to test through research. So I was a part of a lot of FGDs there. That was an introduction to research for me. If I talk about radio, well, I've had like life learnings there. I was there for 12 years. I kind of really grew up and evolved as a person. And that's why that career choice also of, moving to mental health, there was a personal growth there for me. But if I were to talk about really skills that I picked up, I'd say something like, the first one would be sticking to timelines. On radio, I needed to put out a show every single day, come what may. The deadline doesn't shift. And whatever the environment is, I've done a show on, whether it's raining really heavily, when the Mumbai attacks happened, any unfortunate event, you're there on air. So you're automatically trained to stick to timelines. I'd also say problem solving, because as much as it may seem like there's an army, it's actually a one-man army. You rely on yourself. If there's any technical glitch, you cannot say, I'm sorry. You have to do whatever you can to salvage the situation. The buck stops at you. And in the same breath again, because the buck stops at you, the information and the facts that you put out are thoroughly checked. So when you're on air, you're making sure, because you can't come back later and say that this information was handed to me and so I said it the way I did, or I put out whatever information I did. You don't have that space. Once it's out of your mouth, it's out there, and the tongue doesn't have a bone, like we say. So you really have to think this through, which again brings me to my next point, that crisp and concise messaging. So we would run something like a litmus test. Every time you go on air, you put your content through a test to say that what is the kind of response I want this piece of information to elicit from my listener? Will they have an aha moment? Is it something of utility to them? So you have to be very intentional in your messaging. It may seem like what you're saying is organic, but hate to break the news, everything is choreographed. You don't leave anything to chance, because there will be things that will happen that are out of your control. So you need to control everything else that is within your control. Another thing that I learned, is of course using narratives and, storytelling to communicate what you really want to put out there. But, there's a flip side to this also, which again, radio taught me, was that storytelling is just a tool. It's not the pillar, your content is the pillar. So if you don't have content, everything else around it is fluff. So storytelling is a tool, and use it wisely, use it intelligently. And I promise this is the last one now. But I think this is something also Kedar mentioned, about being people-centric. So people are at the center of your work. While the mic is in my hand, I don't have the most interesting and most useful thing to say all the time. I'm there because I have the privilege, it's my privilege that I have the mic. So pass the mic. I did a lot of user-generated content because there are a lot of people out there who have experiences, who have a lot more information to share, which makes much more sense than what I could do, on every show. So all of this is really, like I said, it's life skills. It's, it's really helped me do what I do today at the center. And one very important thing is interpersonal skills. I don't know, I didn't for the longest time believe that this was a skill. I sort of thought that this comes naturally. I thought communication is a natural thing, until I realized that no, this is a skill set, and hey, I'm going to list it down as that, So when I say transferable skills, you really need to look at what you're doing every day. And if someone says you're doing it well, hey, it's a skill. It's not by chance. Yeah, going to pause there, said too much.
Not at all. It's great hearing from you, Meera, and thank you for sharing, telling us how I think creativity, community, but routine as well as passion, how they're all really important ingredients to have for this. career that you're in. I would put my last question actually to Arjun, but we have very few, not a lot of time left. So Arjun, if you could very briefly help me understand a brief overview of potential opportunities available within the mental health policy research sector. I think some attendees here have also asked, and they've been curious about to learn more about the scope of intersection of law, social justice, and psychology.
Thanks, Kimberly. I'm going to try and keep this as concise as possible. So often, when I tell people that part of my work is in policy reform, the first question that I get is that, Acha, so do you write policies? Do you write policies for the government? That is often the misconception when we talk of policy in general, whereas policy is actually a very broad space. And invariably, the way I like to define it, it deals with any kind of engagement that you do with the government, where you're trying to bring about systemic change, whether it's in terms of implementation of a program, whether it's in terms of advocating for a law or a policy, whether it's in terms of monitoring and evaluating a particular, the implementation of a particular law and policy, whether it is providing suggestions for bringing in new kinds of interventions or policy interventions through the government, or if it is actually engaging the larger community of, say, service in the context of mental health, say, service users, people with lived experiences, community advocates, to actually push for and advocate for implementation of mental health laws and policies in India. So it's actually a very broad canvas. And unfortunately, the way policy has been understood in the Indian context, or even legislation, has been always from a top-down approach. And one of the reasons for that is that laws and policies themselves are drafted in ways which are so inaccessible for the layperson to understand, in terms of what's actually written in this. How do I actually make sense of it? And to be honest, as a lawyer, somebody who's undergone 5 years of legal training, etc., there are still days when I do struggle with dealing with some of these documents, despite my training, right? It's not always easy to do that. Whereas I think what we're also trying to do in the work at the center is also to now demystify the law and policy framework for mental health in India, to say that it's not something which laypersons cannot engage with. And we've also been trying to develop programs or tools. So for instance, we developed an app called the MHCA 2017 app, which tries to really simplify the provisions of the Mental Health Care Act for people with lived experiences or their caregivers, so that they know what their rights are. Another example of the work that we're doing is under the Outlive Suicide Prevention Program that we're implementing with Sangat. One of the interventions that we have is a youth advocacy fellowship program, where we are actually building the capacities of 11 youth advocates in Delhi, Bombay, and Pune to work with policymakers or to engage with policymakers on youth suicide prevention. And we're actually looking at how we can simplify the National Suicide Prevention Strategy, the National Mental Health Care Act, or the National Mental Health Policy, and also look at what their communities, the communities that the advocates live in, what are some of their concerns, what are their needs, and then identifying different mechanisms for implementation of these provisions. Now, that could be a health minister, it could be a state level secretary, or it could be a municipal corporator or a ward committee. There are opportunities at each of these levels for us to advocate for mental health and suicide prevention. And the last point that I'd like to make, just in terms of some of the other opportunities to directly work in the policy system per se. So of course, I would put this in sort of three brackets. The first is, of course, academia. So if you can find your way into academia, there's a lot of scope for health systems research or to understand how India's mental health system is functioning, what are the gaps and challenges, and collect data and information. An example of this is an initiative that we started in 2020. It's called the Keshav Desi Raju India Mental Health Observatory. I think we've shared the link over here, where we've been collecting information and data on India's mental health system, on the implementation of mental health legislations and policies, and kind of building their evidence base so that we can then go back to policymakers and pitch for evidence-based policy making. We've been designing tools like gaming simulations and tools with another partner organization fields of view, where we're sort of designing immersive tools so that we can engage different stakeholders, including policymakers, to understand some of the nuances and the complexities of the mental health system. And how do we then address the needs of vulnerable communities or the specific requirements that they might have when they want to access a person-centered, affirmative, and culturally acceptable mental health care and treatment. Other opportunities are also, a lot of state governments have now been opening up positions for consultants. So you can, if there are openings, and this is something that you'll have to look for very closely, but there are openings in health departments or the social justice department where you can come on as a consultant and provide support to the health departments. Of course, at a international level, there are NGOs, like the UNs and the UNICEFs, which also open up positions from time to time. And of course, they're a lot more difficult and inaccessible. But just to give you the wide spectrum of different kinds of spaces in terms of where you can get involved in some of the more hardcore policy work. So yeah, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Arjun, and thank you for that last bit of advice that you've given. I think it's definitely helpful to all the people who are asking questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't address a lot of the questions that you all had, and we did have many more questions in our list. But definitely just goes to show that there's a lot more to discuss and a lot more to talk about. I would like to start off by thanking our panelists who have been so patient and so gracing in being here today, and for doing the absolute most in replying to everyone in the chat section. It's very nice of you all to do that, and very helpful, I'm sure, to all those who had various questions. At the end of today's, after today's meeting, we will be sharing with you some resources. These are resources that will be about securing research internships and with sample application materials. So we're also going to be sending out a brief anonymous feedback form this evening, and we'd be grateful if you could complete that so that we can know which webinars would be of more interest to you in future. At the same time, yes, we would like to thank you for being so flexible and so understanding with your time here today, and thank you for taking out the time being here and making this panel discussion as diverse and as vibrant as it was. Thank you very much, and good evening.